I'm obliged to give Natural Selection 2 a chance. I've been hard on it in the past since I hold the original in such high regards. It's true that I've been a bit unreasonable in my attitude towards the game, but I certainly don't think I've mentioned anything that isn't necessarily true. But let's ignore my presumptions of Natural Selection 2. Let's pretend for a few minutes that I've never played Natural Selection 1. The sequel to one of the biggest independent Half-Life 1 modifications of all time, Natural Selection 2 is poised to be a bigger and better game than its predecessor. And Natural Selection 2 generally plays pretty well. You won't find any iron sights or accuracy modifiers. Instead, the game encourages you to move faster by instilling a sense of panic through a desolate atmosphere and some stealth-focused gameplay. NS2 focuses on ranged versus melee combat, something that you don't see very often in first-person shooters. If you've seen Aliens, then you'll have a pretty good idea of what Natural Selection is about. The game blends both a first-person shooter and a real-time strategy game to create asymmetrical gameplay with two warring sides. Marines are the stoic ranged warriors that use technology to help them wipe out the alien menace. Meanwhile, the Kara are alien creatures that possess a number of different abilities that give them natural advantages over Marines. For example, Skulks, the base unit each player spawns as, plays similar to the aliens from the Alien franchise, with the ability to crawl around on walls. Each Kara unit plays differently from one another, and each has its own purpose. The first few hours of Natural Selection 2 are an intense affair. Aliens hide in dark corners and ambush Marines, which gives the game a great sense of predator-prey gameplay. There's an eerie sense of loneliness as you navigate the narrow corridors, eyes peeled for any movement. All that's missing is the familiar ping of a motion tracker.
It's inside the complex.
While the initial effect of the immersion is great, it subsides quickly. It's very difficult to keep something like this going for long periods of time. The more one plays, the less they'll fear these dark corners, and the less they'll approach empty rooms with apprehension. It's actually a little disappointing that so much work went into the game's aesthetics because of how easily they're forgotten. Much like Crysis, Natural Selection 2 is living proof that gameplay will always trump graphics. And that's what's important, right? How does NS2 play? As a first-person shooter, fights are often frustrating situations where you can't always guarantee to win. You'll often come across situations that you simply can't come out on top of. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, because where in the average FPS you'd have to worry about score, you'd always have to remember the bigger picture in Natural Selection 2, the RTS element. There's always an end goal here to destroy your enemy's base, and so as long as you furthered that along, these frustrating deaths aren't quite as meaningless. Still, that doesn't make me want to throw my keyboard at the wall any less. Onos, the alien tank, is a huge Rhino-type alien that takes a massive amount of firepower to bring down. That's not necessarily to say they're overpowered, you'll just have to travel in numbers. There's always that lingering thought in the back of your mind that everything you're doing is for a greater cause. Step into a command share or hive and you'll understand what I mean. All of a sudden, you'll have an immense amount of power on your hands. Though you'll quickly realize there's far more to commanding in this game than other real-time strategy games, as you'll literally have to convince your units to follow your orders. The commander-player relationship creates an interesting dynamic that can mean the difference between winning and losing a game. Commanders that are assertive can often make powerful changes in the game's flow. There's a big difference here between someone who commands and someone who supports. Troops don't have access to the same tactical view the commander does, so they don't necessarily see the big picture. Still, a team is often limited by the actual individual skill of the players. A commander will rarely get anywhere if his players all have extremely negative kill ratios. Player skill is all over the place in Natural Selection 2, and there's no matchmaking system to compensate. You can command a group of soldiers one round and get a group of crack shots, only to find that the next game your soldiers couldn't hit a stationary target, which definitely highlights just how important player skill is in Natural Selection 2. Individual skill is insanely important in deciding who wins a game. Frustration will build as games progress. As bigger guns and evolved lifeforms come into play, new players will be increasingly frustrated by their inability to make dents in the opposition. A lone marine will never stand a chance against the lumbering Onos, for example. Once again, remembering that everything a player does is for a greater purpose, it's strange that so much more teamwork is required later in the game as opposed to the beginning. As higher tier life forms and technology come into play, it takes more and more players to bring them down. Ending a game is significantly frustrating, with the occasional match resulting in long stalemates and a feeling of helplessness. You'll often end games standing outside the final alien or marine outpost for long, tedious periods, while your commander develops enough tech to power through and finish off the other side. It's a frustrating endeavor, since it's generally painfully obvious when the game is over and it's time to play a new one. Announced in 2006, real work on Natural Selection 2 didn't really begin until 2008 when Unknown Worlds dropped the Source engine and decided to create their own in-house engine titled Spark. It's tough to say if the 4 years of development time on this in-house engine were worth it. Natural Selection 2 itself looks great for an independent game released in 2012, though some would argue that Unknown Worlds itself isn't really independent. The engine contains many of the bells and whistles found in modern games, including a dark and twisted art style that is reminiscent of Alien. Though despite looking technically up to date, it doesn't quite feel like it's up to date. One of the first things you'll notice upon loading up Natural Selection 2 is just how slow everything is. The game takes an immense amount of time to both load initially and then join a server. The interface feels laggy and slightly unresponsive. It's obviously not too much of an issue while playing the game, but it's important to note how much a well-made front end can entice players to continue loading up the game. The second major thing you'll notice comes into play after joining a game, just how poorly the entire thing runs. That's not to say it's unplayable, but when a system can run nearly any modern game at near max settings in 1080p while keeping at stable frame rates, it's a little disconcerting to see a much worse looking indie title have a difficult time maintaining similar performance. Unfortunately, it's hard to overlook this issue and really judge the gameplay. Since Natural Selection 2 is a multiplayer only Twitch shooter, performance issues can really drag a game down. The server tick rate is locked at a maximum of 30. For non-first person shooter veterans, this means that the server updates 30 times a second. NS2 servers require mammoth processors to stay at the tick rate cap. Ones that aren't quite up to par will drop the tick rate even further below 30, often making games unplayable. Thanks to the shaky server performance coupled with the poor client performance, combat will often become a frustrating experience of poor hit registration, warping players, and player rubber banding. That isn't to say there aren't times when a powerful server is available to play on. I've played plenty of games where my gameplay was mostly unhindered by the server performance. I've dedicated an entire section of this review to illustrate just how poor the performance is in Natural Selection 2, not because I'm needlessly trying to put down the game, but to show just how important it is to have a game run well. I mentioned early on that I was a huge fan of the original Natural Selection, so it's important to point out how the game is different from the original. Natural Selection 2 is fast-paced compared to modern shooters. When compared to the original Natural Selection, it feels as if though it's been dipped in a bowl of molasses. Bunny hopping is gone, now replaced by a strange wall jumping mechanic that feels no more intuitive than its predecessor. Bunny hopping was also inherent to every unit in the game, so much of the dynamic movement is missing from this entry. If you're unfamiliar with exactly what skill-based movement brought to games like Natural Selection, check out my previous bunny hopping video. The Alien Commander's Unknown Worlds answer to non-scaling player counts. It's a relatively boring role to play, and because of its inclusion, it's made the Gorge a bore to play. Gorges have now been relegated to heal spray dispensers. It's an attempt to balance the game for higher numbers of players, but it has made the game far less asymmetrical. The original game lacked a commander, creating very asymmetrical gameplay, where one side was led by a commander, while the other was the sum of all its parts. Personal resources have also taken away much of the control commanders had over their units. This can be seen as both a good or bad thing. Players will now have more control over when they get a weapon, but commanders also have far fewer choices to make. It's an improvement for newer players, but it removes much of the strategy for older, seasoned commanders that were already familiar with mechanics of real-time strategy games. The Power Grid is a new system that encourages territory control. The The power must be active in a room for structures to work. It pulls from a box in each room that can be destroyed by aliens. It's an interesting change, but ultimately feels unnecessary in the general flow of things. Before I close this review, I asked several active members of the NS2 competitive community how they felt. Fana, a seasoned Natural Selection 1 veteran, had this to say: NS2 does a lot of things right, but it also does many things wrong. For me, personally, NS2 is a fun game, but not on the same level as NS1. It currently lacks many of the nuances that made NS1 a great game. Swak, an extremely active NS2 player, said, Natural Selection 2 is kind of the same as the original game at the core, but with changed and added stuff. So it doesn't actually play exactly as the first one. That can be both good and bad, as some ideas are great and works well with the core game, while others can be intrusive to the good game experience. It's clear that the general consensus from most Natural Selection 1 veterans that Natural Selection 2 doesn't live up to expectations, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have potential. Unknown Worlds has promised to continue updating the game, and the modability should hopefully increase its lifespan long after people get sick of the normal game modes. It's just too bad so many basic functionality issues hold the game back from being a deep and polished FPS RTS blend.